Welcome to Things You Don't Know. This episode, the second in the Pride Month series, will rattle some cages. Too bad. We'll look at scientific peer-reviewed information. In the next part, we will explore other aspects, including presenting data collected from our original research. I'm referring to part 3 there. Before I go any further, I will be open concerning my interest in this timely topic. In the 70s and 80s, the standard line was that any feelings or gender orientation not conforming to genitals was an aberration. I began my work as a therapist during that time. In my practice, I had the pleasure of being identified by many in the LGBTQIA plus community, although that was not a term we used in those days, as a safe therapist to get help from. Over the years, I uncovered the truth that people in that community were not troubled so much by their gender identity or who they were attracted to for the most part, but did have huge problems with the discrimination they faced socially, economically, and personally. My training and temperament pushed me to examine the science, and I was startled by many things I discovered. I'm not claiming to be able to speak for the LGBTQIA community because I am, after all, a heterosexual male or cishet. I am, however, an ally and a decent enough researcher to report on validated findings. The resources that we are going to use here are really valid resources. They're like from NIH, APA, and Open Mind scientific articles, a bunch of things.
What surprised me is that there seems to be a culture war raging in many parts of America, almost obsessed, but certainly revolving around gender and sexuality. Some people make it appear that we're in the midst of another kind of pandemic of transgender, non-binary, and gender non-conforming, in their stupid phrase, threatening our way of life and targeting our young people, as reported in Open Mind magazine.
But the real threat comes from the misinformation and disinformation, about sex, about gender, about sexuality. A complete war of words that scrambles a simple scientific fact. Gender variation among humans has always been the norm. The only thing that has changed is that people are discussing it a lot more openly now and more honestly. The unfamiliar language and the heated rhetoric have confused so many people amongst the general public. And, it's really worth saying that the idea of gender being on a spectrum is not a new idea at all. It's been around back into prehistory. And nearly every pre-industrial society embraced the concept of a spectrum of gender and sexuality. Someone who identifies as plural, Neptunic, and non-binary, I really do take comfort in the knowledge that I'm not an aberration of humanity, but a permutation of it.
Oh, that needs to be said again. That is so spot on.
I am not an aberration, but rather a permutation.
I do agree with that. And I know there's a little aside here. I know I'm not supposed to take too many asides, but this one deserves it. We're going to explore more in the third part why this happens and some of the less scientific but somewhat supported notions. And one of them is, if this upsets some people, too bad. I think people who are very, very insecure in themselves and what they like and what they do, and that extends to sex and gender, are going to be more defensive and therefore more aggressive in terms of what they say to other people. So anyhow, it's widely stated that around 5% of the American adult population belongs to this community. Now, My personal feeling is that the percentage is more like 5 to 10%. But whatever. It, as has always been true of minorities in the US of A and other places too, to be fair, the majority finds ways to put minorities down, to vilify them, to set them up as targets of political, personal, financial, and physical attacks. Yes, physical attacks.
As a historian, I've seen a lot of that. For many years, there have been several myths surrounding this community, just as there were myths about the African American community and anyone who's basically not a WASP. Some of the predominant myths are that all gay men are effeminate. That's certainly not true. All lesbians are harsh and cold, and that the LGBTQIA community is looking to convert people, especially young people, or that people in the LGBTQIA plus community choose to be in a community. I hate that word, and are therefore just looking for special treatment. The list could go on, and we will get into some of these issues in more depth in part 3. But one major reason for all the attacks against them has been the widespread and dangerous conflagration of the words gender and sex, even by many experts. And this is wrong in more ways than I can count.
A quick aside that I've heard many times from conservative Christians in particular is that the Bible specifically forbids homosexual acts. Well, that's just not true. Bible scholars across the board, except for some very few conservative theologians, and I'm talking about respected Bible scholars and respected theologians, ranging from Harvard to Methodist theologians, have been pointing out for some time that Leviticus, which is what thing that they often point to, clearly what is being said in Leviticus is incest and homosexual rape being forbidden. Incest and homosexual rape, not consensual homosexual activity between consenting adults. In most first world nations, from ancient times until recently, homosexual activity was simply an accepted part of humanity.
That's very true. And we said at the beginning that we would look primarily at scientific data. So let's get into that. Now, from a scientific perspective, the terms biological gender, biological woman, and biological man make no sense, and we just shouldn't use them.
Mm-hmm.
However, the terms sex, female, male, and intersex are scientific and refer to objective biological traits. And while sex does not exist on a full spectrum the way gender does, there are individuals who are born intersex and possess different combinations and numbers of chromosomes. That we have X, XXX, XY, and XYY, just as an example. And thus they will present a mix of sex traits. As the anthropologist Agustin Fuentes of Princeton University recently said, of the 140 million babies born last year, at least 280,000 did not fit into a clear penis versus labia model of sex determination. That means that 0.2%, or 1 in 500 for people that don't do percentages, of all babies born are intersex in the strict medical sense of the word. And according to the Intersex Society of North America, a lot more people than that are born with more subtle forms of sex anatomy variation, some of which won't show up until later in life. Even with those individuals added, the numbers are still pretty low, but it's still significant. It's 1.7% of the overall population.
Indeed. Let's clear up something here first. And this is an issue that many may find confusing in the general population. Gender and sex are not the same.
Say it again. There you go.
Yeah, gender and sex. They're not the same. Gender and gender identity may or may not correspond with sex. Sex is a scientific term, as John said, that applies to anatomy, and gender is not tied to anatomy. Okay? I want to make a strong case for a neurobiological, chromosomal, and neuroanatomic physiognomy forming a basis for a lot of the difference. I was cautioned by John and somewhat by Sean too, not to take too deep a dive into all the scientific side because we'll lose people. Okay, that's true, and also because there are people who they use a pseudoscience and an outmoded and disproven pseudo logic to bolster their prejudicial ideas. Some go so far as to say that there are only two sexes and that some people choose to identify differently for self-serving purposes. That is so 1800s. Okay, here we are. We're in 2023. We're not in the 1800s. Let's use the science we have. Science shows that there are more than two sexes and that people have different gender identities based not on some kind of choice any more than a person chooses to have blonde, brunette, or red hair. I will try and break down the science as much as I can.
May I thank you both for doing that, as scientific research is not my strength. But I do know that gender develops over the lifetime of an individual, starting from the embryonic stage and continues. Individuals have a typical developmental period in the womb and beyond. Their chromosomes signal hormonal releases at very critical periods, producing predominantly male or female features. Research has also indicated that gender identity, and this is very important, gender expression, I'm going to say that again, gender expression is also affected by developmental factors. There are other psychological and social factors which may enhance some of the differences seen.
That's so true. And, to avoid, picking some people off and also just to educate and enhance understanding, we're going to define some terms. So LGBTQIA+, the alphabet soup. It stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, intersex, asexual, and more. Now, lesbian is a word that describes a woman who is sexually, romantically, and or emotionally attracted to other women. And gay describes a person who is sexually, romantically, and or emotionally attracted to people of the same gender or assigned sex. The term can be used to refer to both men and women. And bisexual is a term for a person who has the potential to be sexually, romantically, and or emotionally attracted to individuals with genders that are the same and different from their own along the binary. Let's go take a quick breather here and point out that the words men and women refer to gender identities. They do not refer to sexual traits. So as we said, sex and gender are separate things. So when I say man, I'm referring to someone whose gender is that of a man, who identifies as a man. And when I say woman, I'm referring to someone who identifies as a woman.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Whether they have a penis or a labia, and a vagina.
Whatever junk they got in their trunk is irrelevant as far as gender is concerned. Back to the acronym here. Transgender. It's an umbrella term that's used to describe individuals whose gender identity or gender expression is not the same as their assigned sex. You ask, who assigned sex? Well, usually it's the delivering physician.
Mm-hmm.
They take a look between their legs and see what dangles or doesn't and says, oh, look, it's a boy, or oh, look, it's a girl, which is a kind of a messy and inaccurate way of doing it if you think about it.
But understandable, particularly with the history. Like I say, in the 1800s, we didn't have a way to discover any further. So, of course, there's a penis, it's a boy. There's a vagina, hey, that's a girl. But today, that doesn't hold sway because we do have the science. I'm sorry to interrupt.
Oh, absolutely fine. Back to this definition of transgender. Transgender is an adjective. Someone is transgender. It's not that they are transgender, if that makes sense. It's not a noun. And non-binary is generally accepted to fall under this category. I'm saying that because I identify as non-binary. Then we have queer, the Q in the alphabet soup. It's an umbrella term used to describe individuals who are not exclusively heterosexual. It is often referred by people who find other terms too restrictive in their definitions or connotations.
It's funny because, oh gosh, up until, probably, what would you say, Sean? Maybe 10 years ago or so, 10, 15 years ago, if you called somebody queer, you were using a slur. It was not an accepted term.
Yes, it was totally seen as abusive. A similar thing has happened in some parts of the disability community with the term cripple.
Yep, you're a crip, and I know you know about that one, Sean.
Right? Just like a lot of hurtful language, we've taken back queer. We've taken it back. It's now an identity and an empowerment thing. It's no longer a put down.
Yeah.
And other minorities and repressed people or oppressed people, I'm sure, can relate to that. Every minority group has their own words that they've taken back. Back to the acronym. Intersex. This describes someone born with chromosomes or sexual anatomy that don't fall within the male-female sexual binary. Intersex people can be any gender and don't necessarily identify as transgender. Means they get to be their own thing if they want. Asexual is a term used to describe people who do not experience sexual attraction. Asexual individuals may experience other types of attraction, such as romantic attraction, but do not desire to act on these attractions in a sexual way. I know tons of people who identify as asexual, and I'll say this, just like many other gender identities, it exists on a spectrum of its own as well.
An acronym can't be endless, so that's why the creators have placed a plus at the end of the acronym. Here are some of the other meanings and definitions you will need to navigate the territory. The term cisgender describes a situation where the gender and sexuality expressed align with the sex assigned at birth. The word gender is a socially constructed attribute formed in relation to norms and expectations about behaviors, feelings, and attitudes associated with an individual's assigned sex. There are multiple genders. I will say that again. There are multiple genders, not just men and women, and there is significant cultural diversity in gendered understandings. Gender dysphoria. This is a medical term that refers to feelings of distress or anxiety experienced by individuals whose bodies do not match their gender identity. It can also refer to the negative experiences associated with being misgendered by others.
I'm going to interrupt you just briefly here. That term, gender dysphoria, is very inappropriately used by many in the field. In other words, and that stems from the fact that it used to be thought that anyone, obviously, who didn't fit the cishet mold was upset about their gender, etc. And it was a diagnosable thing, if you can believe that. I mean, and once again, this stems from 1800s sort of science,
If you want to call that science by today's standards.
and it's not. It is not.
Speaking personally here, though, I get misgendered constantly. That's because I do present as very masculine, but I do use they them pronouns and do not identify as male.
It's important to use the pronouns a person chooses to identify as. Now, getting back to the phraseology here, you have gender expression. That's an individual's external manifestations of their gender. And this is expressed through behavior, body presentation, clothing, and pronouns. I want to say that again, it's very important. Expressed through behavior, body presentation, clothing, and pronouns. It is common, though not necessary, for individuals to align their gender expression with their gender identity. Now we come to that word, gender identity. This is an individual's internal, deeply held knowledge or perception of their own gender. An individual can be a man, a woman, non-binary, or any other identity they choose. The term gender nonconforming is a term used to describe gender expressions that differ from normative or conventional gendered expectations. It's very important to remember that a person can be gender nonconforming without being transgender. And the last term, the term that you mentioned, John, identifying with, is non-binary. That's a term that's used to describe genders that fall outside the male-female binary.
Okay. And there are some other terms here. Pansexual, you will hear that. And that's a term that describes people who are sexually, romantically, and or emotionally attracted to people regardless of their assigned sex or gender identity.
That does not mean that someone who is pansexual is indiscriminate or just wants everyone all the time. That's not what it's about. The way I've heard it best described is hearts, not parts.
Yeah, okay. That's a good one. Hearts, not parts. All right. Sex. We've already said it's a biological property. It's based on chromosomal makeup and sexual anatomy. And sexuality or sexual orientation, we're referring to an individual's physical, romantic, or emotional attraction or lack thereof to other people.
Now that we've got some of the terms out of the way, let's go into some of this from a historical perspective here. So, and I guess a lot of it's modern day as well, isn't it?
Yes.
So we have the Bugis of Indonesia, and they recognize 5 different genders. I apologize for the pronunciation. I do not speak this language, so I'm just going to kind of roll with it and approach it phonetically. All right. We have the Oroane, and they are identified with their assigned gender as men. The Makonrai, identified with their assigned gender as women. Kalabai, which is transgender women. Kalalai is transgendered men. And Bisu, which is half male and half female. Bisu are sometimes born with ambiguous genitalia, making them intersex, but that's not always the case. Bisu are thought of as being externally male but internally female. That is, they present as male but have the thoughts and feelings or the spirit of a female. They typically serve as shamans with special connections to the gods. And we have, the Native American cultures, especially in the eastern parts of the United States. they claim a third major gender, and those who express that gender are seen as having two spirits. Two-spirit individuals have special responsibilities around childbirth in particular and are considered to have a closer connection to the spirits in the spirit world. They occasionally marry and carry out the traditional role of a woman. Now, I'm going to go off book here a second. Historically, the Norse people actually did not assign gender to their children until they reached the age of sexual maturity. They played together and were basically given the same pronouns and allowed to reach their own identity as they grew up. They were not treated differently or separately, whether they were biologically or sexually, male or female. No matter what parts they had, they were raised as a non-sexual being.
That's very interesting. I know some of you know I have a background in African history, and the Venda people in Botswana and Swaziland and South Africa have a group like that. They're called the Inkuru, IngoraU. It literally means the dual-minded. These are people that inhabit a intergendered or to use an older term, androgynous role. And they also play a great role in prophecy and spirituality among those people.
We wanted to present these things here, these issues, to point out the absurdity of us not recognizing these other things. It is absurd. And why the hell do we do this? Why? Are we that insecure? Are we that twisted? I mean, these things this has been going on forever. This has been a part of humanity. So why the hell can we not accept it now?
Well, I think that there is a comfort for some people in a dichotomy. There's this group and that group. And to further complicate things, gender expression and gender norms change over time. I'm in my late 40s, and when I was very young, earrings, for example, were seen as an expression of femininity and female identity. And the only acceptable way for heterosexual men to wear them was as a single stud in the left ear. But today, earrings of various types and sizes are common in both ears of people of all genders.
That's not even talking about other constructs like makeup or high heels. And those things are considered to be feminine for the most part, even today.
Yeah, tell that to the people in Great Britain. You see the pictures of men in high heels. Only it's just not mentioned. We don't point it out, but it's true. It's actually true. Look at some of the pictures, folks.
And then if you want to talk about makeup, look at the Egyptians, the Middle East in general. It's very common, even today in a lot of places for men and women to both wear makeup. And I think it's important to note here that clothing, makeup, words, phrases, none of those things by themselves have a gender. They are just things.
Oh, yeah. It's like, okay, I well remember in the 50s and to some extent in the 60s, although it was changing by that time, pink. If a man wore pink, he was gay. And that's not true. And interestingly enough, historically, Sean, pink used to be considered a masculine color, correct?
You're quite correct. There's a famous photograph of President William McKinley, and he's actually wearing a pink blazer.
Mm-hmm.
This is as late as the early 20th century. So those things do tend to vacillate.
Even professions. Being a cheerleader was originally considered to be something, a job only a man could do.
Mm-hmm.
if I remember correctly, both of the Bushes that were president were cheerleaders.
I don't know. I don't remember that, but whatever.
He's right on. They were. I've seen photos.
And that's great. And it is interesting that that has carried over to some extent because most cheerleading squads uh, today do still have at least some males in them. It's kind of cool.
I'm just pointing these things out to illustrate that gender and sexuality and your gender identity should not be exclusive to the things that you wear or the things that you do. It's an ongoing and a shifting target. And the expressions of gender, while they do tend to correlate with an individual's sex, don't necessarily do that. There's a lot of cross-cultural and tons of research that make it incredibly clear that human sexuality, which is who you want, does have some biological underpinnings, but is fluid in nature and exists on a spectrum. And gender expression tends to develop after sexuality and can shift over time and context, not just culturally, but for the individual.
This is going to really be news to some people, but if you look at some of Freud's writing, you need to look at it in the original and not some of the kind of skittish translations. But he said at one point that he thought that it was highly likely that the most stable and well-adjusted person would be bisexual. Just an interesting aside. I'm sorry to interrupt, John. Go ahead.
Oh, that's fine. And this spectrum of sexuality is not just exclusive to humans. Dolphins, garter snakes, lions, and our closest living relatives, the chimpanzees and bonobos, they demonstrate varying and widespread sexuality. And that's in nature. That's not just a human cultural construct. It is a natural way of living. And while some same-sex relations are rather formulaic amongst chimpanzees, the bonobos' sex lives are almost as varied as ours. In both sexes and all ages regularly engage in same-sex relations, and those things have very little, if anything, to do with reproduction. And it happens all the time, not just between pairs, but also groups. And it doesn't seem to have anything to do with age or rank, although it does seem to reduce tension. And I mean, I think we all get that, all right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Sexuality has clear biological underpinnings. Just going to say that again. But gender is something that is uniquely human. And again, it doesn't always have to represent an individual's sex.
An interesting little illustration of gender and sex was a situation of a boy who identified as male. He had a penis and testicles. He was fertile. He produced viable sperm. Okay. He was having these severe abdominal bloating and pain periodically.
And all of the women in the audience know exactly where this is going right now.
I would hope so. So the situation got so bad that his parents took him to the emergency room where it was discovered that in addition to the external male parts, penis and testes, he had female internal parts. He was menstruating, but there was no avenue for the blood to exit his body, so he was literally drowning from the inside.
I know there was also a news story. This surprised me, but it's absolutely true. About a 66-year-old man who discovered on a trip to a doctor he was biologically female.
That would be a shocker, huh?
This might seem absurd or even impossible, but of course, it's not. It's far more common than the general population realizes. The famous Journal of the Royal Society of Medicine points out that one of the first modern cases came from the famous Berlin 1936 Olympics. An American named Stella Walsh repeatedly crushed the competition. She always changed by herself and had facial features and muscle tissue that resembled a man. The Olympic Committee did an examination during which the members found that Stella was, in fact, both male and female, sort of. She had ambiguous genitalia, and it was impossible in those days to determine her biological sex. This remained a secret until Stella's death in 1980.
Yeah. Okay, let's review some basic biology. Before we had the ability to go in depth, to do in-depth research concerning DNA and karyotypes, it was widely thought that an embryo's sex was determined at conception and that there were only two sexes, male and female. Okay, today we have refined the science and we can correctly examine genetics and DNA, allowing us to examine karyotypes. The advent of the electron microscope and some other things really had a lot to do with that. We know without question that humans are not just born male and female. There are at least 6 biological sexes that can result in fairly normal lifespans. Now, there are actually many more than that, but the others result in spontaneous abortion, and so I'm not going to get into those.
Most of the time.
Most of the time, yes, that's true. All right, so the 6 most common karyotypes are X, and that's 1 in 2,000. It's called Turner syndrome. XX, most common form of female. XXY, it's roughly 1 in 500 people. That's often identified as Klinefelter's. XY, which is the most common form of male, and XYY, that's roughly 1 out of 1,000 people have that, and XXXY, and that's approximately 1 in about 18,000. Okay, so getting back to our little form here, at conception, the embryo has the tubing for both male and female sex. It is not until around week 7 of gestation that the process of sex differentiation begins. If the sex chromosome has an SRY variant on the stretch of that chromosome, called an SRY variant, the embryo secretes an anti-estrogen substance, and the embryo will develop male genitalia. Now, this does not affect other things. We're talking about the formulation of genitalia. Female ovaries develop under the influence of a competing set of genes that are influenced by the expression of DAX or DAX1 on the X chromosome and act antagonistically to SRY. And I'm throwing around a lot of terms here, but just to give you some idea. Please note that we are talking here about sex genitals, not the other factors which go to brain chemistry and indeed brain physiognomy, which are the prime determinants, in my opinion, of gender identity and gender expression.
And I'm just going to say this. And while there is an undeniable genetic component that influences a person's identity, it doesn't mean that it's something to be cured or treated. Identity is not an illness.
Yeah, identity is not an illness. It is not an aberration to be cured, and any more than curing somebody of saying they're a human being. It's not an illness. It's not an aberration. It is a normal variant. So that brings us to this other thing, which really is something that really pisses me off. So excuse me if I get a little carried away. Talking about conversion or reparation centers and the practices they utilize. And what these are is there some people will send their kids. I can't believe that this would happen, but they still do it today. They'll send their kids to these places, these reparation or conversion centers, in the hopes that they will have their orientation changed, that they will become, properly who they are, whatever the frick that means. In these centers, they use physical abuse, such as electric shock. For example, attaching electrodes to a genetically sexed male and shocking them when they have any thoughts or are in the presence of any non-heterosexual kind of activity. They use physical attacks. They hit them. Psychological abuse, such as isolation, humiliation, torturous behavioral techniques. You might be familiar with milder forms of this in the movie Clockwork Orange.
The Ludovico effect, right?
Yes, that's a good catch. Chemical abuse. Chemical abuse. What am I talking about? They give these poor children drugs if they think they're going to make their minds change or something. Surgical abuse, such as giving people lobotomies, for God's sake. And how they do it, I'll just tell you so that you can get a real picture of why this pisses me off so much. They remove an eyeball and drop it down, which you can do, which is done sometimes for other really good reasons. And they take a thing which looks remarkably like an ice pick and they jam it into the brain because you can reach that fairly easily through that opening and whip it back and forth until the frontal lobe is disconnected from the rest of the brain. Sweet, right? These.
It's not just that they do. They'll also force sexual assignment, or I'm just going to say that sexual assignment surgeries on intersex people as well, which is horrific and involuntary and incredibly wrong.
And the amazing thing is that they do this stuff in spite of the fact that there's no valid evidence of anyone's identity being changed. And the fact that the people that are subjected to this horror suffer the scars for a lifetime. It screws them up big time in ways that you can't even think about undoing. I worked with a kid. He was probably 17 at the time that I saw him, who had been to one of these things, and he kept escaping. And oh my God, I don't know what's happened to him now, but I mean, he was just destroyed as his identity was destroyed. Didn't know what it was. Didn't know if he was a member of the human race. It was horrible. And that's part of the reason I have real feelings about this. But anyhow, there are still some conversion reparation centers still operating in the USA. Yeah, today. Although the list of states that have outlawed the practice is growing. These torture houses have been operating since at least the 19th century. Since the 19th century, continuing to today. And Biden is the first president to actively seek to shut them down. Can you believe that?
That's and beyond even measurable horror. I'm literally sitting here shaking, folks, thinking about this. It's entirely to the president's credit that he's stopping that. I've seen some of these movies about some of these wretched places. One is called Boy Erased. Another one's called But I'm a Cheerleader. And there's one coming out on next Netflix called Pray It Away. They make me want to vomit. It just doesn't seem possible that this thing is happening today in the 21st century in the United States of America. We need to stop this now. This is Nazi style torture, totally unworthy of any kind of sane nation. Every professional medical and psychological organization in the US, the World Health Organization, and the United Nations have banned this infamous practice.
Neuroanatomical differences based on sexual orientation in human males have been found. Dr. LeVay reported that the third interstitial nucleus of the anterior hypothalamus in homosexual men is smaller than in heterosexual men and has a similar size in homosexual men and women. McFadden reported that functional properties of the inner ear and of the auditory brain circuits differ between the sexes and between heterosexual and homosexual individuals. An interesting and somewhat controversial one is if you take your hand, particularly your dominant hand, and you put the palm facing you and your fingers horizontal, and you look at the difference in size between your index or digit 2 and your ring digit 4, size difference. That ratio is called the 2D 4D ratio. All right. And it's the 2D 4D ratio is generally smaller in men than in women, although the validity of this measure as a marker, it's influenced by a lot of different things. Nonetheless, numerous studies have reported that the 2D 4D ratio is also on average smaller in lesbians than in heterosexual women, a finding that has extensively been replicated and suggests that testosterone plays a role in female sexual orientation. And yes, males and females both have testosterone and estrogen in their systems. I could go on a long time about this. Brain mapping shows that there is a difference. And I'm not going to do that because it would probably be beyond the scope of this. There's still a lot of research that needs to be done, but it is clear that the LGBTQIA plus members are not defective or aberrant. Okay, once again, not defective, not aberrant. It's just a different expression. These differences have been present in humans and other animals as far back as we know. Gender and sex develop at different times, and they can vary. The brain anatomy differences that I was talking about, they develop at a different time than the genitals and the differentiation there. And it's not because some people are defective. That's not it. That's not why I'm saying this. And if you want to twist the science and make it seem like that, then you're wrong. You are wrong. It is really not that at all. It is saying that, hey, there are normal, and I emphasize normal, structural variants in humans. It would be the same, twisting the science in the way that I just suggested that some people may want to do is about the same as saying, well, then females are stupider than males because, males' brains are bigger. That's true.
It's true that the brains are bigger. I'm just going to clarify that.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, you're exactly right. However, there are other things. Female brains, females by and large are better at color discrimination. They are better at natively. When I say natively, I mean without training. They can hear certain intervals in music more clearly and easier than males. So does that mean they're smarter? No, it doesn't. Does it mean they're different? Yes. Does it mean that everyone is different? Yes. Everyone is different. Everyone has differences, but they're normal. They're not an aberration. They're normal variants.
I feel like what you're trying to say here, and I'm just going to summarize it into a nice little soundbite, is that members of the LGBTQIA plus community are not wrong. They are not sick. They are simply beautiful permutations of humanity.
Okay. Yeah,
Absolutely.
I'll buy that. Absolutely. Well, look, we've gone on for a while, and trust me, I had to restrict myself, hold myself back because there is so much information. The bottom line is if you don't like people that are in the LGBTQIA community, okay, that's your thing. But if you do it on the basis of the being members of that community, then you are wrong. You are ignorant. Now, do I think?
And if you discriminate against someone based off of their identity, their sexuality, their sex, any of that, you're wrong. It's just there's no opposite side to that argument. You are wrong.
Well, that's true. And, Dr. Deneen has said to me a few different times that he's experienced some of this kind of prejudice because he's in a wheelchair, and he's said that people have kind of implied to him that he is hypersexual because all of those Crips are.
Or conversely, I've been infantilized because it's assumed I don't have the capacity to desire anything. Never mind romantic relations, but work or recreation or anything beyond staring at the squawk box. So I thank you both for bringing that up. And if I may just say very briefly, John, it's such a joy to have you back with us
Oh,
again.
God, yes.
You give an amazing contribution to the podcast and to both our lives as individuals. And it means a great deal to me, and I'm sure it does to your dad as well.
It's definitely a pleasure to be back as well. And I'm really very extremely excited about the next segment.
Yes.
Personally, we worked really hard, put in I don't know how many hours transcribing and gathering these testimonials from a questionnaire that you two created. And the results of that we got from those respondents, some of it was uplifting, some of it was heartbreaking, and all of it is just so real. And I really hope we can definitely get into that. It will probably happen after Pride Month is over, but you know what? I feel pretty confident in saying that the LGBTQIA plus community exists and it needs support all year round.
Well, yes.
Indeed.
The reason we did that too is because there is an avalanche of information and misinformation, and my thought was we need to go to the source. We need to see what people in that community are saying, and the results just kind of, I don't know, it really opened my eyes on a few things, because I really hadn't honestly considered the wide variation within the community. And there's a huge difference for everybody. And it makes sense, though. It really makes sense because everyone's experience is going to be individual. So it means there's a huge difference. And I am excited about bringing that information to the public. I truly am. And a lot of work, as you say, has gone into it. Well, anyhow, thanks for listening today. And, I hope that you will join us. Again, we have, as was pointed out, we have the third installment of this particular series coming up as soon as we can. And we have a lot of other things coming up too, which I think will be exciting for people to hear. So from me now, I will say goodbye, and we look forward to hearing from you and seeing you soon.
Yeah, don't forget to send us a like and hit that little reminder bell so you don't miss this next one because it's going to be awesome.
See you soon, folks. Bye for now.